When a billionaire wakes up from a coma, his entire world has changed. His fortune is gone, his family has betrayed him, and the only person he can trust is the kind-hearted nurse's aide who talked to him while he was unconscious. Now, he must choose between the power he's always known and a love he never expected to find. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sun was setting over Manhattan when Marcus Stone stepped into his black Mercedes. At 45, he was at the top of his game, CEO of Stone Technologies, engaged to socialite Victoria Shaw, and about to close the biggest deal of his career. His phone buzzed again with another message from Victoria about their upcoming wedding. He barely glanced at it. Just one more stop, he told himself, heading to the office to grab the contracts he needed to review over the weekend. The streets were quiet as he drove through a less affluent part of town. His mind wandered to the wedding, now just 2 weeks away. Victoria was perfect on paper, beautiful, from a good family, and she understood the social obligations that came with his position. But lately, something felt off. She seemed more interested in planning elaborate photo shoots for their engagement than spending actual time with him. His phone buzzed again. Victoria wanted to discuss the seating arrangements. Marcus reached for the phone, taking his eyes off the road for just a second. That's when everything changed. He didn't see the truck running the red light until it was too late. The impact was devastating. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and Marcus's world went black. Grace Johnson was just finishing her shift at City General Hospital. At 35, the single mother of 2 had been working as a nurse's aide for the past 10 years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and let her take care of her kids, Tommy and Lisa. Incoming trauma! The announcement echoed through the emergency room. Grace was about to clock out, but something made her stay. When they wheeled him in, she recognized him immediately from the business magazines. Marcus Stone, one of the richest men in New York. Multiple injuries, possible head trauma, the paramedic reported. Car accident. In the chaos that followed, Grace found herself assigned to his care. She watched as doctors worked to save his life, and when they finally stabilized him, she was the one who cleaned his wounds and made sure he was comfortable. Days turned into weeks. The media camped outside the hospital, desperate for news about the billionaire in a coma. Victoria made appearances for the cameras, always perfectly dressed and tearfully declaring her love. But Grace noticed she never stayed longer than 15 minutes. Grace, on the other hand, spent hours in Marcus's room during her shifts. She talked to him while changing his bandages and checking his vitals. She told him about her kids, about her dreams of going back to school someday, about anything that came to mind. "You know, Mr. Stone," she said one evening while adjusting his pillows, "your fiancée has great taste in flowers, but I don't think she realizes you're allergic to lilies. I noticed you sneeze in your sleep when she brings them, so I've been moving them to the hallway." Marcus's brother Richard started showing up with lawyers, having papers signed by their mother, who held Marcus's power of attorney. Grace overheard enough to know something wasn't right. They were selling off parts of Marcus's company, making deals that seemed rushed. "I wish you could wake up and see what's happening," Grace whispered one night while checking his temperature. "I don't think your family has your best interests at heart." A month into his coma, Grace noticed Victoria's visits becoming less frequent. The gossip magazines were already linking her to a young real estate developer. Richard's visits consisted mainly of hushed conversations with lawyers in the hallway, but Grace kept talking to Marcus, kept caring for him with the same gentleness she'd shown since day one. She brought in a radio and played classical music, remembering an article she'd read about him being a fan of Mozart. "Your brother sold another part of your company today," she told him while giving him his sponge bath. "And your fiancée was photographed having dinner with someone else. I know it's none of my business, but I think you deserve better than people who only care about your money." Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, something changed. As Grace was checking his vitals and telling him about her son's baseball game, Marcus's fingers moved. She held her breath, watching carefully. His eyelids fluttered. "Mr. Stone," she said softly, "can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face. Grace hit the call button for the doctor, her heart racing. What she didn't know was that Marcus had heard more during his coma than anyone realized, and his first clear memory was of a kind voice telling him stories, making him feel less alone in the darkness. The world Marcus Stone would wake up to was very different from the one he'd left behind. His company was in pieces, his fiancée had moved on, and his family had betrayed him. But there was one person who had stood by him, one voice that had guided him back to consciousness. As the doctors rushed in to examine him, Marcus's eyes stayed fixed on Grace, the woman who had talked to him all those days when everyone else had abandoned him. He didn't know it yet, but she would become the most important person in his new life, a life that was about to change in ways neither of them could imagine. The news of Marcus Stone's awakening spread through City General Hospital like wildfire. Within hours, the parking lot was filled with news vans, and reporters camped outside trying to get the first photo of the billionaire who had cheated death. Grace stood back as doctors swarmed around Marcus's bed, running tests and asking questions. His voice was weak from disuse, but his mind was sharp. The first question he asked shocked everyone in the room. "Where's the woman who's been talking to me? The one who told me about her children?" The doctors looked confused, but Grace felt her heart skip a beat. She tried to slip out of the room unnoticed, but Marcus's eyes found her. "You," he said softly. "You're the one who's been here all along." Before Grace could respond, the room was flooded with new arrivals. Victoria burst in, perfectly made up for the cameras that would surely follow, while Richard arrived with a team of lawyers. The quiet intimacy of the moment shattered. "Darling," Victoria rushed to Marcus's side, air kissing his cheek. "I've been absolutely devastated. I've hardly slept." Grace watched as Marcus stiffened at Victoria's touch. His eyes kept drifting back to Grace, even as his fiancée put on a show for everyone present. "I need to speak with my brother alone," Marcus announced, his voice stronger now. "And then I want to talk to—" He looked at Grace's name tag, "Miss Johnson." Victoria's perfect smile faltered. "But darling, we have so much to discuss. The wedding plans have been on hold for months." "Out," Marcus said firmly. "Everyone except Richard." Grace slipped away as the room cleared. She went about her duties, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. For months she'd talked to an unconscious man, sharing her thoughts and feelings. Now that he was awake, she felt strangely exposed. The conversation between the brothers didn't last long. Shouting could be heard through the closed door, and Richard stormed out, his face red with anger. A few minutes later, Marcus asked for Grace. When she entered the room, he was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than before. "You've been taking care of me," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's my job, Mr. Stone." "Marcus," he corrected. "And no, it wasn't your job to read to me or tell me about your children's school plays or warn me about what my brother was doing to my company." Grace felt her face grow warm. "You remember all that?" "Not everything," he admitted, "but enough. I heard your voice in the darkness. You were the only one who treated me like a person, not a bank account." Before Grace could respond, Victoria reappeared, this time with a magazine photographer in tow. "Darling, everyone's dying to hear your story. We should do an exclusive about our enduring love." Marcus cut her off. "There is no our anymore, Victoria. I know about the real estate developer. James Carson, isn't it? The photographers caught you at Le Cirque last week." Victoria's face went pale. I was lonely. You were in a coma." "Get out," Marcus said quietly. "And take your cameras with you." After they left, Grace started to leave too, but Marcus caught her hand. His touch was gentle but firm. "Tell me something," he said. "All those hours you spent here, talking to me, caring for me. Why?" Grace looked down at their joined hands. "Because everyone deserves to be treated with kindness, Mr. St. Marcus, even billionaires." He smiled, and for the first time Grace saw the man behind the headlines, vulnerable, hurt, but with a warmth in his eyes that made her heart race. "I'd like to hear more about Tommy's baseball game," he said, "the one where he hit his first home run. I remember you telling me about it, but I want to hear it again." Over the next few days, as Marcus regained his strength, he and Grace fell into a routine. She would come by during her shifts, and they would talk. He told her about growing up with the pressure of the family business, about his doubts regarding Victoria, about his dreams that had nothing to do with making money. Grace shared stories about her kids, her struggles as a single mother, her hopes of becoming a registered nurse someday. Marcus listened with genuine interest, something she wasn't used to from the wealthy patients she usually cared for. But not everyone was happy about their growing closeness. Victoria had gone to the press, painting herself as the devoted fiancée cruelly cast aside. Richard was spreading rumors about Marcus's mental state, suggesting that the coma had affected his judgment. And then there were the hospital gossips, whispering about the nurse's aide who was getting too friendly with the billionaire patient. Grace tried to ignore them, but the words stung. One evening, as Grace was finishing her shift, she overheard two nurses talking. "She's just after his money, obviously," one said. "These rich men are all the same. They fall for the first pretty face that shows them attention when they're vulnerable." Grace rushed past them, fighting back tears. She was so distracted that she didn't notice Marcus had wheeled himself to the nurse's station in his wheelchair. "Grace," he called out, making her stop. "Don't listen to them. They don't know you like I do." "And how do you know me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I know you're the kind of person who talks to coma patients about Mozart, who remembers their allergies and moves flowers without being asked, who risks her job to warn an unconscious man about people taking advantage of him." He reached for her hand. "I know you're the reason I found my way back." As Grace looked into his eyes, she realized that something profound had changed in both their lives. But with that change came a frightening question. What would happen when Marcus Stone, billionaire CEO, no longer needed the care of Grace Johnson, nurse's aide? Marcus's recovery was progressing faster than anyone expected. His determination to regain control of his life showed in every physical therapy session. Grace often watched from the doorway as he pushed himself, working harder than the therapists asked, driven by a fierce need to stand on his own 2 feet again. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, Grace found him sitting in his wheelchair by the window, staring at his laptop with a frown. "Bad news?" she asked, bringing him his medication. "Richard's been busy," Marcus said, turning the screen to show her. "He sold off 3 of our main divisions and merged 2 others. The company I built is being torn apart, piece by piece." Grace set down the medicine cup. "Can't you stop him?" "Not until I'm officially declared competent to resume control. The doctors say that could take weeks." He slammed the laptop shut. "By then, there might not be much left to save." Without thinking, Grace put her hand on his shoulder. The touch was meant to comfort, but the moment her skin met his, something electric passed between them. Marcus covered her hand with his, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The spell was broken by a sharp voice from the doorway. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Elena Stone, Marcus's mother, stood there in her designer suit, her disapproving gaze fixed on Grace's hand on her son's shoulder. Grace quickly stepped back. "Mother," Marcus said coldly. "What an unexpected surprise." "Obviously," Elena replied, her eyes still on Grace. "I can see you're being well attended to." "Miss Johnson is one of the reasons I'm alive," Marcus said firmly. "She's been more faithful in her care than my own family." Elena's perfectly lined lips tightened. "Darling, let's not be dramatic. We've all been absolutely sick with worry. Victoria's been inconsolable." "Victoria's been dating James Carson for the past 2 months," Marcus shot back. "The society pages have been quite thorough in their coverage." "A simple misunderstanding," Elena waved her hand dismissively. The poor girl was distraught. James was merely offering comfort during a difficult time. Grace began to quietly gather her supplies, hoping to slip away, but Eleanor's voice stopped her. "Oh, and Miss Johnson, is it? The head nurse mentioned something about a complaint. Apparently, some people feel you're spending an inappropriate amount of time with my son." Grace felt her face burn. Marcus wheeled his chair around to face his mother. "Any complaints about Miss Johnson can be directed to me," he said, his voice hard. "And while we're discussing complaints, would you like to explain why you signed over control of the Pacific Division to Richard without consulting me?" Eleanor's face paled slightly. "You were in a coma, darling. Decisions had to be made. Decisions that just happened to give my brother control of the most profitable part of my company." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Grace tried again to leave, but this time Marcus caught her wrist. "Stay," he said softly. "Please." Eleanor watched this exchange with growing horror. "Marcus, you can't be serious. This woman is a servant." "This woman," Marcus's voice rose, "has shown me more loyalty in 3 months than you have in 45 years. The argument that followed was intense but brief. Eleanor left in tears, promising that Marcus would regret choosing that woman over his family. After she was gone, Grace sank into the chair beside Marcus's wheelchair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to cause problems with your family." Marcus took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. "My family caused their own problems. You're the only honest thing in my life right now." That night, after her shift ended, Grace couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Marcus, about the way he'd defended her, about the warmth of his hand on hers. It was dangerous to feel this way about a patient, especially one like Marcus Stone. Their worlds were too different. But the next morning when she arrived at work, she found her world turned upside down. The head nurse called her into the office first thing. "Miss Johnson," she said, not meeting Grace's eyes, "we're transferring you to the pediatric ward, effective immediately." "But why?" "The Stone family has expressed concerns about your relationship with Mr. Stone. They've made some calls to the hospital board." Grace felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. They can't do that. They donate millions to this hospital every year. They can do whatever they want. When Grace went to tell Marcus about the transfer, she found his room empty. A nurse told her he'd been moved to a private rehabilitation facility early that morning. He hadn't even had a chance to say goodbye. Back home that evening, Grace tried to focus on making dinner for her kids, but her hands were shaking. Tommy and Lisa knew something was wrong, but she put on a brave face. Then her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "They can move me to another facility, but they can't stop me from thinking about you. M." Grace stared at the message, her heart pounding. She knew she should delete it, forget about Marcus Stone, and go back to her normal life. But as she looked at the words on her screen, she realized something terrifying. She was falling in love with him. What she didn't know was that across town, in a luxurious rehabilitation center, Marcus was lying awake, looking at her contact information on his phone. His mother's threats echoed in his head. If he pursued anything with Grace, Elena would make sure Grace lost not just her position with Marcus, but her job at the hospital entirely. Marcus had spent his life making tough business decisions, but none had ever felt as important as the one he faced now. Could he risk Grace's livelihood for a chance at happiness? And even if he did, would she want a man whose family was willing to destroy her life to keep them apart? 2 weeks had passed since Marcus's sudden transfer to the Mountain View Rehabilitation Center. The facility was exclusive and luxurious, but to Marcus it felt like a prison. Every day he went through his physical therapy exercises mechanically, his mind always drifting back to Grace. His phone buzzed with another message from his brother Richard. "Board meeting tomorrow. Final vote on the Carson merger. Last chance to be reasonable." Marcus deleted the message without responding. He'd spent the past 2 weeks gathering information, making calls to loyal employees, and slowly piecing together exactly how his family had taken advantage of his coma. The picture it painted made his blood boil. Meanwhile, Grace was struggling to adjust to her new position in the pediatric ward. The work was rewarding, but her heart wasn't in it. Every time she passed the floor where Marcus had been, she felt a pang in her chest. "Mum, are you okay?" Tommy asked one evening as she burned dinner for the 3rd time that week. "You seem sad." Grace hugged her 12-year-old son. "I'm fine, honey, just tired." "Is it because of that rich man from the hospital?" Lisa, her 10-year-old, piped up. "The one whose picture is always in the magazines." Grace nearly dropped the pan she was holding. "What magazines?" Lisa ran to get a gossip tabloid from her backpack. On the cover was a grainy photo of Grace helping Marcus with his physical therapy. Under the headline, "Billionaire's Mystery Woman." "Who is the nurse who stole Marcus Stone's heart?" "Oh no," Grace whispered, sinking into a kitchen chair. But before she could process this new development, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found James Carson, Victoria's new boyfriend and the man trying to take over Marcus's company. "Miss Johnson," he smiled smoothly. "May I come in?" Grace's protective instincts kicked in. "Tommy, Lisa, go to your rooms, please." Once the children were gone, James made himself comfortable on her worn couch. "I'll get right to the point. How much?" "Excuse me?" "To stay away from Marcus Stone. Name your price." He pulled out a checkbook. "Everyone has one." Grace felt her face grow hot with anger. "Get out of my house." "Don't be hasty," James said. "Think about your children. A single mother's salary doesn't go far these days. I'm offering you enough money to send them both to college." "I said get out!" After James left, Grace's hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial her phone. She called the number Marcus had texted her from, but it went straight to voicemail. What she didn't know was that Marcus was already on his way to her. He'd seen the tabloid story and knew his family would react. His physical therapist had cleared him to walk with a cane, and he'd immediately called his driver. When Marcus's car pulled up outside Grace's modest apartment building, he saw James Carson leaving. His grip tightened on his cane, but he forced himself to wait until James drove away. Grace opened her door to find Marcus standing there, leaning on his cane but looking stronger than she'd ever seen him. "Marcus, you shouldn't be here." "Carson offered you money, didn't he?" Marcus interrupted. "To stay away from me?" Grace nodded, stepping back to let him in. Tommy and Lisa peeked out of their rooms, eyes wide at the sight of the man from the magazines. "Kids," Grace said softly. "This is Mr. Stone." "Marcus," he corrected her, smiling at the children. "I've heard a lot about you both." While the kids peppered Marcus with questions about his cars and if he really owned a helicopter, Grace watched in amazement. This powerful businessman who could buy and sell entire companies was sitting on her shabby couch, genuinely interested in Tommy's baseball stories and Lisa's art projects. After the kids went to bed, Marcus turned to Grace. "I'm taking back my company tomorrow. The board is voting on selling to Carson's firm, but I've spent 2 weeks building my case. I can prove Richard and my mother violated their fiduciary duties." "Will that be enough?" "It has to be. But Grace," he took her hand, "I need you to know something first. If I win tomorrow, I'm going to make some enemies. Powerful ones. My family, Carson, Victoria. They'll all come after me. And you." Grace squeezed his hand. "I'm not afraid." "You should be." "I am." He touched her cheek gently. "I've spent my whole life caring about money and power. Then I woke up from that coma and realized the only thing that mattered was the sound of your voice in the darkness. Marcus, let me finish. Tomorrow, I'm going to walk into that boardroom and take back what's mine. But none of it means anything if I don't have you by my side." And there in Grace's small living room, with its second-hand furniture and crayon drawings on the fridge, Marcus Stone kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, Grace whispered, "What happens now?" "Now?" Marcus smiled. "Now we fight back, together." What they didn't know was that Elena Stone was already planning her own counterattack. She'd hired private investigators to dig into Grace's past, determined to find something, anything, she could use to protect the family name from what she saw as a gold-digging interloper. And in his office across town, Richard Stone was shredding documents, trying to hide the evidence of just how much of his brother's company he'd sold off while Marcus was unconscious. The stage was set for a showdown that would change all their lives forever. But for that one moment in Grace's apartment, none of that mattered. For that one perfect moment, it was just a man and a woman who had found each other against all odds, ready to face whatever came next as long as they were together. The morning of the board meeting dawned bright and clear. Marcus adjusted his tie in the mirror of his penthouse apartment, trying to hide how nervous he really was. Everything he'd built over the past 20 years hung in the balance. His phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "Remember, no matter what happens today, you're not alone anymore." Those simple words gave him strength. He grabbed his cane and headed for the door, ready for battle. The Stone Technologies building dominated the Manhattan skyline, its glass towers reaching toward the clouds. As Marcus's car pulled up to the entrance, he saw the crowd of reporters waiting. News of his return had leaked, and everyone wanted to witness the showdown. "Mr. Stone, is it true your brother sold off major divisions while you were in a coma?" "Mr. Stone, what about your relationship with the nurse?" "Mr. Stone, will you contest your mother's power of attorney?" Marcus ignored them all, walking steadily with his cane through the lobby he hadn't seen in months. Employees stopped and stared, some breaking into spontaneous applause. He'd always tried to be a fair boss, and it showed in their reactions. The boardroom was on the top floor. When Marcus walked in, Richard nearly dropped his coffee cup. Elena's perfectly maintained face showed the first cracks of genuine fear. Victoria was there too, sitting next to James Carson as if she belonged. "What is he doing here?" Richard sputtered. "This meeting is for board members only." "I'm still the majority shareholder," Marcus said calmly, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Or did you forget that while you were selling off pieces of my company?" "Now, darling," Elena started, but Marcus cut her off. "Save it, mother. I have copies of every document you signed, every deal you made, every penny you gave to Richard while I was unconscious." He pulled out a thick folder. "Would the board like to see exactly how the Stone family took advantage of my coma?" The other board members murmured among themselves. These were serious business people who had trusted the Stone family for years. "You were incapacitated," Richard argued. "Someone had to make decisions. Decisions like selling our technology division to Carson's company for half its market value." Marcus turned to the board. "I wonder if anyone told you that my brother received a personal kickback for that deal." The room erupted in chaos. James Carson jumped to his feet, his face red. "These are baseless accusations." "Are they?" Marcus pressed a button on his phone. A familiar voice filled the room. Richard's voice, recorded during a secret meeting with Carson, discussing how to carve up Stone Technologies while Marcus was in his coma. Elena's face had gone chalk white. "How did you get that?" "I had help," Marcus smiled. "Turns out there are still loyal people in this company, people who kept records, who knew something wasn't right." Victoria stood up, her designer dress rustling. "Marcus, darling, surely we can discuss this like family." "Doris, family?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "You were photographed with Carson while I was still in intensive care. some family. The board members were now openly glaring at Richard and Carson. These were old-school businessmen who valued loyalty and honor as much as profits. "I move for an immediate vote," said Harold Jenkins, the eldest board member, "to remove Richard Stone from his position and return full control to Marcus." "I second that motion," another member quickly added. Richard jumped to his feet. "You can't do this, Mother, tell them!" But Eleanor Stone was staring at her hands, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The vote was unanimous. Richard was out, Carson's deals were suspended pending investigation, and Marcus was reinstated as CEO with full powers. As Richard stormed out, followed by a crying Victoria and a furious Carson, Marcus thought it was over. But then, his mother spoke. "If you think this is the end, you're wrong," she said quietly. "Wait until everyone sees what I found out about your precious nurse." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor pulled out another folder. "Did you know your girlfriend has a criminal record?" Marcus's heart stopped for a moment, not because he cared if Grace had a past. He loved her no matter what, but he knew how much she cared about her job at the hospital, about providing for her kids. "I've had her investigated thoroughly," Eleanor continued, clearly enjoying herself. "Would you like to know what I found?" Before Marcus could respond, the boardroom door opened. Grace walked in, her head held high. "Why don't you ask me directly, Mrs. Stone?" The room fell silent. Grace looked different than she had in her hospital uniform. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. But it was her dignity, her quiet strength, that commanded attention. "You want to tell everyone about my criminal record?" Grace's voice was steady. "About how I was arrested at 19 for stealing medicine." Eleanor's triumphant smile faltered. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. "Yes," Grace continued, "I stole antibiotics from a pharmacy for my little sister who was dying of pneumonia because we couldn't afford the prescription. I pled guilty, did community service, and that's why I decided to go into healthcare, to help people who had no one else to turn to." Marcus stood up, moving to Grace's side. "The board should know," he said clearly, "that I'm in love with this woman. She saved my life, in more ways than one. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take their investments elsewhere." Eleanor stood up, shaking with rage. "You would choose this criminal over your own family?" "No, Mother," Marcus said quietly. "I'm choosing love over greed, honesty over manipulation. The person who stayed with me at my worst over the people who betrayed me at my most vulnerable." He turned to Grace, taking her hand. "I was going to wait to do this, but now seems perfect." To everyone's shock, especially Grace's, he got down on one knee, ignoring the pain it caused his still healing body. "Grace Johnson, you brought me back to life. Will you marry me?" The boardroom was silent as a tomb. Grace looked at Marcus, tears in her eyes, then at Eleanor's horrified face, then back at Marcus. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Eleanor's scream of rage was cut off by the boardroom erupting in applause. Most of these hardened business people had known Marcus since he was a young man. They'd seen him build the company with his own hands, and now they were witnessing him find true happiness. As Marcus kissed Grace in front of everyone, Eleanor stormed out, followed by her few remaining allies. But neither Marcus nor Grace noticed. They were too lost in each other, in the promise of a future that neither of them had imagined possible just a few months ago. What they didn't know was that Eleanor Stone wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As she left the building, she was already making plans. If she couldn't stop this wedding through legitimate means, she would have to resort to more desperate measures. But for now, in that boardroom high above Manhattan, love had won the first battle. Marcus and Grace held each other, ready to face whatever came next together. The news of Marcus Stone's engagement to a former nurse's aide exploded across the media. Some papers called it a real-life fairy tale. Others, influenced by Eleanor's connections, painted Grace as a gold digger who had taken advantage of a vulnerable patient. Grace tried to shield Tommy and Lisa from the worst of it, but it wasn't easy. One morning, Lisa came home from school in tears. The other kids had been teasing her, saying her mom was only marrying Mr. Stone for his money. "Why are people so mean?" Lisa sobbed into Grace's shoulder. "Because they don't understand love," Grace said, holding her daughter tight. "Real love doesn't care about money or what other people think." Marcus was furious when he heard about Lisa being bullied. That evening, he came to their apartment with a surprise. "I bought the building," he announced casually. Grace nearly dropped her coffee cup. "You what?" "And the 2 buildings next door. I'm turning them into affordable housing for hospital workers." He smiled. No one can evict you now, no matter what my mother tries. Grace should have been happy, but something bothered her. Marcus, you can't just throw money at every problem. Why not? I have it, and I want to help, because I need to know you understand the difference between protecting us and trying to own us. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You're right, I'm sorry, I've spent my whole life solving problems with money. This is all new to me. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. When Grace opened it, she found a social worker standing there. Ms. Johnson, I'm from Child Protective Services. We've received some concerning reports about your children's living situation. Grace felt her heart stop. What reports? The social worker pulled out a file. We have allegations of neglect, unsuitable living conditions, and she glanced at her papers. Possible drug use? That's ridiculous. Marcus stepped forward. Who made these accusations? I'm afraid that's confidential. But they all knew who was behind it. Elena Stone had found a new way to attack, through Grace's children. The next few weeks were a nightmare. CPS investigations, surprise visits, endless questions. Grace had to prove she was a fit mother, all while dealing with reporters camping outside and gossip magazines painting her as a villain. Marcus watched helplessly as the woman he loved suffered. He offered to hire the best lawyers, to buy off the right people, but Grace refused. I won't prove them right, she said firmly. I won't use your money to make problems disappear. I've been a good mother for 12 years, and I'll prove it the right way. But Elena wasn't done. One evening, as Grace was leaving the grocery store with Tommy and Lisa, a woman approached them. Are you Grace Johnson? The woman looked nervous. I'm Marcus's ex-wife, the one he never told you about. Grace felt the grocery bag slip from her hands. What? He was married before Victoria. Ask him about what happened to all that missing money. Ask him why the marriage really ended. Before Grace could respond, the woman disappeared into the crowd. Tommy helped his mom pick up the scattered groceries, while Lisa watched with worried eyes. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Grace confronted Marcus. Were you ever going to tell me about your first wife? Marcus's face went pale. How did you... She found me today. Said something about missing money. Marcus sank into a chair, looking suddenly older. It was 15 years ago. Sandra and I were young, ambitious. She worked in the company's finance department. One day, we discovered millions missing from the accounts. What happened? She said she was being framed, that someone else had stolen the money, but all the evidence pointed to her. He stopped, pain clear in his eyes. I testified against her. She went to prison, and now, she was released last year. I tried to make amends, offered her a settlement, but she refused. She said she'd rather destroy my happiness like I destroyed hers. Grace felt her head spinning. Did she really steal the money? I thought so at the time. Now, I don't know. Richard was already working at the company then. He could have framed her. Before they could discuss it further, Grace's phone rang. It was Tommy's baseball coach. Ms. Johnson, I'm sorry, but Tommy can't play in tomorrow's game. Some of the parents complained. They don't want the publicity. Grace hung up, fighting tears. Everything she and her children had built, their normal, happy life, was being torn apart. Marcus pulled her into his arms. We can move away, start fresh somewhere else. Running won't solve anything, Grace said. Your mother, your ex-wife, the press, they'll follow us anywhere. We have to face this. Then we face it together, Marcus said firmly. But first, there's something I need to do. The next morning, Marcus walked into Richard's office, unannounced. Hello, brother, he said coldly. Let's talk about Sandra and the missing money. Richard's face showed a flicker of fear before he could hide it, and in that moment Marcus knew his brother had framed an innocent woman, and Marcus had helped send her to prison. As he left Richard's office, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Dinner tonight, just you and me, come alone, or Grace's children might find their mother's fitness as a parent questioned in court. Marcus stared at the message, his hands shaking with rage. His mother was threatening innocent children in her desperate attempt to control him, but this time, she'd gone too far. What Elena didn't know was that Grace wasn't the same woman who'd once stolen medicine out of desperation. She was stronger now, smarter, and she had something worth fighting for, not just Marcus's love, but her children's future and her own dignity. And Marcus wasn't the same man who'd once chosen his family's lies over his wife's truth. This time, he would stand by the woman he loved, no matter the cost. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would either tear them apart or prove that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. But first, They had to uncover the truth about Sandra and the missing millions, a truth that could destroy not just Eleanor and Richard, but the entire Stone family legacy. The restaurant Eleanor had chosen for dinner was the kind of place where a meal cost more than Grace's old monthly salary. Marcus sat across from his mother, watching her sip expensive wine as if she hadn't just threatened his future stepchildren. "Darling," Eleanor said sweetly, "you know, I only want what's best for you. By attacking innocent children, I'm protecting our family name. That woman and her offspring have no place in our world." Marcus leaned forward. "Those offspring are going to be my children soon, and Grace will be my wife. Not if certain documents about her past find their way to the right authorities." Eleanor's smile was cold. "Did you know she once had a drug problem? You mean the prescription painkillers she was given after a car accident 10 years ago? The ones she stopped taking as soon as she realized she was becoming dependent?" Marcus watched his mother's smile fade. "Yes, I know all about it. Grace told me everything." "Then you know she's not fit to be a Stone." "No, Mother. I know she's stronger than anyone I've ever met, including you." Meanwhile, across town, Grace was having her own important meeting. Sandra Stone, Marcus's first wife, had agreed to meet her at a small coffee shop. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Sandra said, stirring her coffee nervously. "I need to know the truth," Grace replied. "About the money, about Marcus, about all of it." Sandra looked around carefully before pulling out an old flash drive. "I've kept this for 15 years. It's everything I found before they framed me. Proof that Richard was embezzling money through fake companies. Why didn't you use this in court?" "Because Eleanor made it clear that if I did, my little sister would lose her scholarship to medical school. The Stones paid for her education, you see. It was their way of keeping me quiet." Grace felt sick. "Why show me now?" "Because I saw how they're trying to destroy you through your children, just like they destroyed me through my sister." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want revenge anymore. I just want the truth to come out." Back at the restaurant, Marcus was about to leave when Eleanor played her final card. "If you marry her, you'll lose everything," she said. "The company, your inheritance, your position in society." Marcus stood up. "No, Mother. You're the one who's about to lose everything." He pulled out his phone and played a recording. Eleanor's earlier conversation with Richard about framing Sandra 15 years ago. He'd hidden a device in Richard's office before confronting him. Eleanor's face went white. "Where did you get that?" "I learned from the best, didn't I? You always taught me to have leverage." Marcus's voice was hard. "Now listen carefully. You will call off the CPS investigation. You will leave Grace and her children alone, or this recording goes to the police, the press, and Sandra's lawyers. You would betray your own mother, like you betrayed me. You let me send an innocent woman to prison to protect your precious Richard." Marcus grabbed his coat. "I'm done letting you control my life." As Marcus left the restaurant, his phone rang. It was Grace. "I'm with Sandra," she said without preamble. "Marcus, she has proof about everything." "I know. I just confronted Mother with a recording of her and Richard discussing the frame-up." He hailed a taxi. "Where are you?" "The coffee shop near the hospital." "Marcus, there's more. Sandra found evidence that Richard is still doing it, creating fake companies, stealing money. He never stopped." Marcus felt a chill. "Stay there, I'm coming." But when he arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes later, Grace and Sandra were gone. His calls went straight to voicemail. Then a text arrived from an unknown number. "Your mother isn't the only one who knows how to play dirty. Want to see your precious Grace again? Bring $50 million in wire transfers to the old Stone warehouse. Come alone." Marcus's hands shook as he read the message. Richard must have followed Sandra, realized she still had evidence against him. Now he had Grace. Another text arrived, this one with a photo. Grace and Sandra tied to chairs in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Grace's face was bruised, but her eyes in the photo were fierce, defiant. Marcus called the police, but he knew Richard would have lookouts. If they saw police cars approaching, Grace and Sandra could die. He had to make a choice: follow Richard's demands and risk losing everything he'd spent his life building, or risk losing the woman he loved. For Marcus Stone, who had once chosen money and family loyalty over truth and justice, it wasn't even a choice anymore. As he drove toward the warehouse, Marcus made one last call to Tommy and Lisa's babysitter, making sure the children were safe. He wouldn't let them lose their mother. Not like this. What Marcus didn't know was that Grace wasn't just sitting quietly, waiting to be rescued. Even now she was working to free herself, whispering words of encouragement to a terrified Sandra. Grace Johnson had survived poverty, scandal, and Eleanor Stone's worst attacks. She wasn't about to let Richard destroy everything she and Marcus had built. And in her pocket, carefully hidden, was Sandra's flash drive. 15 years of evidence that could bring down not just Richard, but half the corrupt business elite in New York. The sun was setting over Manhattan as Marcus parked near the warehouse. In his briefcase were the wire transfer codes Richard had demanded. In his heart was a determination he'd never felt before. One way or another, this would end tonight. The old stone warehouse loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows like empty eyes staring down at Marcus. As he approached the side door, briefcase in hand, he could hear his heart pounding in his ears. Inside, Grace and Sandra sat bound to chairs in what used to be the main office. Grace's lip was bleeding where Richard had struck her, but her eyes burned with determination. She'd managed to work one hand partially free, though she kept it hidden behind her back. "So you know," she said to Richard, who paced nervously in front of them, "for someone from such a good family, you're not very smart." Richard spun around. "Shut up. You don't know anything about my family. I know you're terrified right now," Grace continued calmly. "You're sweating, your hands are shaking. These aren't the actions of someone in control." Sandra caught on to what Grace was doing, keeping Richard distracted, off balance. "She's right, Richard. This isn't going to end well for you." "I said shut up." Richard pulled out a gun, waving it between them. 15 years ago, you almost ruined everything, Sandra. I won't let it happen again." The door creaked open, and Marcus stepped in. When he saw the gun in his brother's hand, his face went white. "I brought what you asked for," Marcus said, holding up the briefcase. "Let them go." Richard laughed, but it was a desperate sound. "Show me the transfers first." While Richard's attention was on Marcus, Grace managed to free her other hand. She caught Sandra's eye, giving her a slight nod. Marcus opened his laptop, showing Richard the bank screen. 50 million, ready to transfer. Just like you wanted. "You always were the golden boy," Richard spat. "Everything came so easy to you, the company, mother's love, all of it." "Easy?" Marcus's voice rose. "I worked every day of my life while you stole and lied and cheated, and now you're holding innocent women at gunpoint?" "Innocent?" Richard gestured wildly with the gun. "Sandra was going to expose everything. And your precious Grace? She'll destroy our family name, drag us into the gutter where she belongs." That's when Grace made her move. She launched herself from the chair, tackling Richard's legs. The gun went flying as they crashed to the floor. Marcus rushed forward, but Richard was already scrambling for the weapon. Sandra, who had also freed herself, kicked it away. "It's over, Richard," Marcus said, helping Grace up. "The police are already on their way." "No!" Richard pulled out a phone. "One call and every newspaper in the city gets proof of Grace's criminal past. Her drug problem, everything. Your perfect little romance will be destroyed." Grace stepped forward, despite Marcus trying to hold her back. "Go ahead. Release it all. I'm not ashamed of my past. Everything I did to survive, to protect the people I love. Can you say the same?" The sound of sirens filled the air. Richard's face crumpled as he realized he had nowhere left to run. "Mother will never forgive you for this," he said to Marcus. "Mother's the one who taught me to record interesting conversations," Marcus replied. "Like the one where she admitted helping you frame Sandra. The police have that recording now too." Richard lunged for the gun one last time, but police officers burst through the door at that moment. Within seconds, he was face down on the floor, being handcuffed. As the police led Richard away, Grace finally let herself shake. Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine." She touched her split lip. "Nothing that won't heal." Sandra watched them with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "No." Marcus turned to her. "It's my fault. I should have believed you 15 years ago. I should have stood up to my family then." "We can't change the past," Grace said, taking Marcus's hand. "But we can make sure the truth comes out now." Outside, news vans were already arriving. Elena Stone stepped out of her town car, her face ash-white as she watched her son being put into a police car. "Marcus," she called out desperately, "we can fix this. We can keep it quiet. Just think of the family name." But Marcus walked past her, his arm around Grace. Sandra followed, holding the flash drive that would expose 15 years of Stone family corruption. The family name. Marcus stopped and turned to his mother. "Grace taught me something important, Mother. Real family isn't about names or reputations. It's about love, truth, and standing by the people who matter." Elena watched helplessly as Marcus, Grace, and Sandra got into a police car to give their statements. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Back at Grace's apartment, Tommy and Lisa ran to hug their mother, as soon as she walked in. They had been worried sick when the babysitter wouldn't tell them where she was. "Mom, your face!" Lisa touched Grace's split lip gently. "I'm okay, sweetie," Grace assured her. "Everything's going to be okay now." Marcus watched this tender family moment, his heart full. He had lost his company fortune, his family connections, and his social standing. Richard and Eleanor would face criminal charges. The Stone family would never be the same. But looking at Grace with her children, he knew he had gained something far more valuable. A real family built on love and truth instead of power and lies. What he didn't know was that Grace had another surprise waiting. During those terrifying moments in the warehouse, she had made a decision that would change all their lives forever. A decision she would share with Marcus once the children were asleep. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was their story. After Tommy and Lisa were finally asleep, Grace and Marcus sat on her small balcony. The city lights twinkled below them, and despite her bruised face, Grace had never looked more beautiful to Marcus. "The police said they have enough evidence to put Richard away for a long time," Marcus said, holding an ice pack to Grace's lip. "Mother too, probably. They're looking into all the company records now." Grace took his hand. "Are you okay? This is still your family. You and the kids are my family now." He squeezed her hand. "The company, the money, none of it matters compared to that." About that, Grace took a deep breath. "I made a decision tonight, while I was in that warehouse. Watching you choose love over money, seeing how far your family would go to keep their power, it made me realize something." Marcus waited, feeling his heart race. "I don't want any of it," Grace said firmly. "The mansion you bought us, the trust funds you set up for the kids, the new car, I want you to take it all back. Grace, I want to provide for you and the children. I know you do, but I need to know that we can make it on our own, that we're choosing each other, not security." She touched his face gently. "I love you, Marcus Stone. Not your money, not your name, just you." Marcus felt tears in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying let's start fresh. Sell the company, give the money to charity. Help Sandra set up a foundation to help women who've been wrongly imprisoned. Let's move somewhere new, somewhere nobody knows the Stone name. And do what? Whatever we want. You're brilliant with business. You could start something new, something honest. I can finish my nursing degree. The kids can grow up away from all this scandal and corruption." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "My whole life has been about the Stone legacy, the company, the fortune, the reputation. And has it made you happy?" He looked at her, this incredible woman who had brought him back to life in more ways than one. "No, but you do." Grace smiled, then winced as it pulled at her split lip. "So let's do it. Let's leave it all behind. My mother would have a heart attack. She's probably going to jail anyway." They both laughed and Marcus pulled her close. "You're amazing, you know that. Most people would be trying to grab everything they could after what happened." "I'm not most people." "No, you're not." He kissed her forehead. "Okay, let's do it. Let's start fresh." The next morning, Marcus called an emergency board meeting. The press was still buzzing with news of Richard's arrest and Elena's involvement in the 15-year-old fraud. "I'm selling my shares," he announced to the shocked board members. "The company will be restructured, with profits going to set up a foundation for wrongly convicted women. Sandra will run it." The business world was stunned. Marcus Stone, walking away from a billion-dollar empire. The gossip columns went crazy with speculation, but Marcus didn't care. He was too busy helping Grace pack up her small apartment, planning their move to a quiet town on the coast, where nobody had ever heard of the Stone family. Tommy and Lisa were excited about the move, especially when they learned their new home would be near the beach. They didn't care about giving up their trust funds or fancy new clothes. They just wanted their mom to be happy. Sandra stopped by to say goodbye. She looked years younger now that the truth was finally out. "The foundation is already getting calls," she told them. "There are so many women out there who need help." She hugged Grace tightly. "Thank you for helping me find justice and for showing me that revenge isn't the answer." Victoria showed up too, trying to win Marcus back now that her relationship with James Carson had fallen apart. "Darling, be reasonable," she pleaded. "You're giving up everything for this?" She gestured around Grace's modest apartment. Marcus smiled. "No, Victoria, I'm giving up nothing. I'm gaining everything." The day they left New York, Eleanor managed to get a message to Marcus from jail. "You're making a mistake," she wrote. "The Stone name means something in this city." Marcus wrote back one line, "Love means more." As they drove out of the city, Tommy and Lisa sleeping in the back seat, Grace looked at Marcus. Any regrets? He thought about his empty mansion, his corporate office, his family's legacy. Then he looked at Grace with her healing split lip and fierce love, at the children who would soon be his, at the simple gold band on Grace's finger that meant more than all his family's wealth. Just one, he said with a smile, that I didn't meet you sooner. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder as the city disappeared behind them. They had no idea what the future held, but they knew they would face it together. What they didn't know was that their story would inspire others. Sandra's foundation would go on to help hundreds of women. Richard's arrest would expose corruption throughout New York's business world. And somewhere in a prison cell, Elena Stone would finally begin to understand what real love looked like. But the biggest changes were still to come. Grace had one more surprise for Marcus, one that would make their fresh start even more meaningful than either of them could imagine. 6 months had passed since Marcus and Grace left New York. They'd found a beautiful old house in a small coastal town in Maine, where the neighbors didn't care about the Stone name or New York society scandals. Marcus had used a small portion of his remaining money to buy a local medical supply company, determined to build something honest from the ground up. Grace stood in their kitchen watching Tommy teach Marcus how to make pancakes, while Lisa set the table. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making the simple gold bands on her and Marcus's fingers sparkle. They'd had a quiet wedding on the beach 2 months ago, with just the kids, Sandra, and a few new friends as witnesses. "Mom, you're doing it again," Lisa said with a smile. "Doing what?" "That dreamy look, like you can't believe this is real." Grace hugged her daughter. Sometimes she couldn't believe how much their lives had changed. Tommy and Marcus had bonded over baseball and fishing. Lisa had started painting again, no longer worried about fitting in with wealthy private school kids. And Grace, well, she had her own wonderful secret to share. The morning paper lay on the counter, featuring a story about Elena and Richard Stone's sentencing. They'd both gotten prison time for fraud and corruption. Sandra's foundation was mentioned too. It had already helped 3 wrongly convicted women regain their freedom. "Breakfast is ready," Tommy announced proudly, carrying a slightly lopsided stack of pancakes to the table. As they ate breakfast together, laughing and talking about their plans for the day, Grace knew it was time. "I have something to tell you all," she said, her heart racing with excitement. "I went to the doctor last week." Marcus's fork clattered to his plate. "Grace, are you okay?" She reached for his hand. "I'm perfect, and in about 7 months our family is going to get a little bigger." The kitchen erupted in chaos. Lisa squealed with delight about becoming a big sister. Tommy pumped his fist in the air, already planning to teach the baby baseball. And Marcus just stared at Grace with tears in his eyes. "A baby?" he whispered. "We're having a baby?" Grace nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "That's not all. The doctor said, it's twins." Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The kids joined the hug, creating a family circle that made Grace's heart feel like it might burst with joy. Later that afternoon, they walked on the beach together. Tommy and Lisa ran ahead, chasing waves and collecting shells. "I have a confession," Marcus said, holding Grace's hand. "I got a letter from Mother yesterday." Grace tensed slightly. What did she want? To apologize, believe it or not. She saw a picture of our wedding in the society pages. Said we looked happy, really happy. Not the fake kind she always insisted was so important. "Do you think she means it?" Marcus watched the kids playing. "I think losing everything made her see what really matters. She asked if she could write to us sometimes after she gets out. Said she'd like to know her grandchildren." Grace touched her stomach, where their twins were growing. "What do you think?" "I think everyone deserves a second chance at love. You taught me that." He kissed her softly. "But this time, we do it on our terms. No manipulation, no power plays, just family." That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, Grace sat on their porch swing watching Marcus teach Tommy how to repair his bike. Lisa was drawing in her sketchbook, occasionally showing her mom her progress. Grace thought about the journey that had brought them here. A car accident, a coma, a hospital room where a lonely nurse's aide talked to an unconscious billionaire. All the threats, schemes, and dramatic confrontations that had tried to keep them apart. But love had won. Not the fancy, glamorous kind that Victoria had pretended to feel, or the controlling kind that Elena had insisted was proper. Real love, messy and honest, and stronger than any fortune. Marcus looked up and caught her watching him. His smile still made her heart skip a beat. "I love you," he mouthed silently. Grace touched her stomach, feeling the future growing inside her. The twins would never know the corrupt world of the old Stone family. They would grow up in this house by the sea, with a brother and sister who already loved them, and parents who had given up everything to choose love over power. "Ready for dinner?" she called to her family. As they gathered around their kitchen table, so different from the formal dining room in Marcus's old mansion, Grace looked at the faces she loved most in the world. Tommy and Lisa, happy and secure in their new life. Marcus, who had walked away from a fortune to build something real, and soon, two more precious additions to their family. She remembered that first night in the hospital, talking to an unconscious man about her hopes and dreams. She could never have imagined then that she was speaking to the love of her life, or that her simple act of kindness would lead to this much happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked softly. Grace smiled. "About second chances, and how sometimes the best dreams are the ones you never knew you had." Outside, the waves crashed against the shore. In New York, Sandra was helping another innocent woman find justice. In her prison cell, Elena was learning what real family meant. And in their cozy house by the sea, Grace and Marcus Stone held hands under the table, surrounded by the pure, simple love that had conquered wealth, power, and corruption. Their story had come full circle. The nurse who had saved a billionaire's life had, in the end, saved much more than that. She had shown him and everyone else that true love was the greatest fortune of all. And as the sun set on another perfect day in their new life, Grace knew that this was just the beginning. Their greatest adventure, raising their children in a home filled with love and honesty, was still to come. Some might call it a fairy tale, but Grace knew better. It wasn't about castles or fortunes or living happily ever after. It was about choosing love every single day. It was about building something real from the ashes of something false. It was, quite simply, about finding your way home. And they had finally, beautifully, found theirs. The end.